Hello and welcome to episode 384 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm hectic, Andy. I've got this sense that there is so much to do and also cram into the podcast that it feels almost overwhelming at times. There's so many things I wanted to talk about this week on the podcast that I'm not able to, like savings rates being one of them, something that we are probably going to come back to because there's some positive news out there for savers at the moment. So it may be something that we do in a subsequent podcast just to point out to people that if you are a saver, then interest rates have been going up, which is good news. So while we tend to focus a bit on the mortgage side and debt side, obviously for those of you out there who have large savings, then there is some good news as rates are going up. But I'm not going to focus on that. But yes, Andy, very busy. We're also going to be even busier next week because they've announced that not only is there going to be the Bank of England base rate decision, which was postponed this week until next week, but we're also going to have a mini budget. So you may not have noticed because there's been lots of other news out there at the moment, but there's going to be a mini emergency budget on Friday coming. So that's something to look out for. So depending what's in that, we may well cover that in next week's podcast if there's any big announcements. So yes, Andy, busy as ever it would seem. But on that note, I did have time to look online at some of the reviews people have sent in, which has been fantastic. So we've requested people send in reviews. Please, if you've not reviewed the podcast yet, or you haven't done it recently, because you can actually review a podcast more than once if you reviewed it some time ago, then please leave a review on whatever app you use, and we will read out a bunch of them in an upcoming show. It also is incredibly motivating for me and the team, and who knows, you might actually get a Money to the Masses mug. It's been a while since we've given away a Money to the Masses mug to any listeners.
Okay, so you mentioned there about savings rates, Damien. Like you say, we're not going to go into detail on that because rates are changing almost week by week, and it is good news for savers. I did write a news piece on that just to sort of give the headlines on where rates are at the moment, and I will link to that in the show notes because it does give an overview of the fact that easy access accounts are currently pushing up towards 0.9%, which is actually the highest rate that we've seen since December 2012. And even 1 year fixed ISAs are now pushing towards 2%, which again is the highest levels we've seen since November and December 2012. So have a little read of that if you like. I will caveat that these rates are ever changing, but again, it's good news for savers. They're on the up, which is good news. Right, so Damien, let's move on. What's coming up on this week's show?
So the three pieces I want to talk about this week are inflation rates. So it was revealed this week that the official UK inflation rate dropped from 10.1% in July to 9.9% in August. So it's still massively high, but we don't all feel the same level of inflation, and it's quite an important concept that people understand. And so I want to explain to people how we don't, why we don't feel the same rate of inflation, and how you can actually work out what your personal rate of inflation is and why you should do it. I also want to talk about something called survivorship bias, and I will reveal more when I do the piece on what it is and why it's important, especially for investors. And the other piece I want to do is a cost of living checklist. Now, this is something completely different. It's not about cutting individual bills or anything like that. This is about flexibility and ensuring you have that going into a period where things could get tight and difficult for your personal finances. So this checklist includes some of the things that I'm doing in the background of my own finances, and I wanted to bring that onto the podcast.
Okay, so let's start with inflation then. What have we got? So
people will be well aware about inflation being high. And just to reiterate, inflation is the measure of the increase in prices in the UK, and that could be prices of products or services. And it is tracked officially by the Office of National Statistics. And what they do is they will go around and they will look at the cost of goods and services. They will compare them month on month and over a period of time from 150 random UK outlets. So they look at 700 different goods and services to create what is a basket of goods and services that allows them to give a headline measure of what's happening to prices. Now, the basket of goods just to let people know if they are unaware, is ever evolving. So there are products in there, and if you look at it, you can go on the Office of National Statistics and look at the basket and what it contains, but the basket does change over time to reflect the fact that our lives do change. So just to give you an insight, this year there was an update to the basket, as there is every year, and the things that dropped out of the basket that are no longer included in the calculation of the change in prices are donuts, coal, men's suits and laminate flooring. So laminate flooring is now out. I mean, I've had laminate flooring in my house until I moved forever. It was there when I moved in and it was there when I moved out at the end of last year. So clearly I was not on trend in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, I think all of those things there that you mentioned, they kind of make sense. Donuts is one that sort of stumped me though. Surely people are still eating donuts, aren't they?
That's what I thought. Donuts seemed odd. Now, men's suits is interesting because that is a reflection, in my opinion, of the pandemic. If you look at the things that went into the basket this year, examples included meat-free sausages, sports bras, pet collars and antibacterial wipes. Now, if the last three don't scream pandemic, then I don't know what does, because obviously there's been changes in trends of people's clothing. People are wearing much more relaxed stuff, no longer wearing suits as much. And it seems that everybody, if they didn't have a pet, got a pandemic puppy of some kind or a cat. So they reflect the spending patterns of the UK. So now the ONS tracks the price changes in items like that. People may also be wondering, it's not just about the prices going up and down, but they do look at something called shrinkflation as well. So now when you go and buy your chocolate bar and you go home and moan about the fact that, look at the size of this chocolate bar, it's a fraction of what it was before. They track the change in what you get for the price. So the price may have stayed the same for that chocolate bar, but what you're getting is much less. They take that into account. So they can't get anything past the ONS. They're quite on it. They know what these manufacturers are doing. Now, pretty much anything you can think of that you would buy will be in the ONS basket. But there are some odd things that you might not realise are in there. One example is climbing wall sessions, and another one is dating agency fees. So that shows you how granular this stuff goes. Now, it was announced, as I mentioned in the introduction, that the rate of inflation in the UK, as measured by the Consumer Prices Index, now there are different measures of inflation, but this is the one that the headlines focus on, fell from 10.1% in July to 9.9% in August. Bear in mind that the Bank of England is tasked with keeping that rate of inflation at 2%. So that is the official rate they're meant to be keeping inflation at. They will raise interest rates, lower them to try and manipulate that inflation figure. And of course, that's why we're seeing interest rates go up, as we've explained before on the podcast. Now, as I mentioned, there are other measures of inflation like the Retail Prices Index, and that includes housing costs as well, such as council tax, mortgage payments and insurances. So you will often see that associated with things like increases to certain maybe pensions or benefits of some kind, although those things have tended to change where they picked CPI because it tends to be lower. Now, when they look at the changes in prices, different products change price at different rates. So in the latest numbers, what we saw was the price of petrol fall. So that meant that the influence of petrol prices on that rate of inflation was less than it had been in the past, because when prices were rocketing, as we know they have done, then that would have pushed up that rate of inflation. Now, the issue is that we don't all experience the same rate of inflation because it depends what sort of things you buy that are from that basket of goods. But more importantly, inflation disproportionately hurts those on lower incomes. And the reason is, if you look at what's contributing to inflation at the moment, year on year, energy's gone up 69%, groceries are up 13% compared to August last year, so this August to last August. Mortgage and rent is up about 4%, petrol is up 32%, and holiday costs are up about 11%. Now, if you think about people who are on lower incomes, they will spend a higher proportion of their money on food and energy and petrol, the sort of things that they have to use because maybe they're trying to get to work and just to survive. And so that means if most of your spending is on those items, your inflation rate will be far higher. Now, if you look at the other end of the scale and the areas where we saw the lowest rate of inflation, so the lowest increase in prices year on year. They were things like financial services products and insurances, which went up 2%, healthcare, which went up 3%, and things like media subscriptions, which went up about 1%. So that would include things like the TV license, but there are other media subscriptions that people have that can include things like Netflix, etc. So people who are on lower incomes tend to have a higher rate of inflation and are disproportionately affected by it, which is why we saw earlier in the year quite a backlash when inflation figures were being produced. And we saw Jack Monroe, who we talked about on the podcast, try and create an alternative measure of inflation, something that was more realistic to a wider selection of the population. So it raises the question is, what is your individual inflation rate? Now, fortunately, you can find a calculator. Now, the ONS have brought back their personalised inflation calculator because it had been sort of left to gather dust. And the FT have done a very good one as well. And we'll put links to both of those in the show notes. If you go and use those calculators, then what it does is you put in your spending patterns. It's very loose. It will ask you how much you spend maybe on a mortgage, how much you spend on petrol a month. So it doesn't take very long. And then it will tell you what your personalized inflation rate is, where inflation is hurting you the most, so where prices are rising the fastest in your budgets. And it compares it to the official inflation rate. Now, that calculator actually does not CPI, but something called CPIH, which is CPI plus housing costs. Now, that figure is lower than the official CPI rate. So the CPI rate, like I said, in July was 10.1%. If you take account of the housing cost as well, it's about 8.8%. So that means the rate that you will be given on the calculator will be about 1.2 to 1.5% lower than your equivalent you would pay on CPI that you could then compare to the headline rate. And so what you'll see is how your personal inflation rate compares to official rates. And the reason the CPIH figure is lower is because housing costs tends to lag when it comes to price rises. So go and look at the calculator, run your numbers, see what you come back with, and then what it will do is it will enable you to learn where inflation is hitting you the hardest, and then you can start to scale back maybe spending in those particular areas. It will be the areas most likely that I mentioned earlier, such as groceries and energy, but now we've got the energy cap that's come in that we mentioned on last week's podcast. But it will enable you to therefore adapt some of your spending as well. There will be people who are very conscious of the increase in prices anyway without doing a calculator, but I think for the majority of people, when we went and ran this through the office and online and asked people, most people were shocked and surprised at the rate of inflation that they were paying. So find out what yours is. And also what it will do is it will make you more acutely aware of inflation and the importance of it for you personally. And now that is going to be important for you going forward, especially when it comes to pay review times. I do realise that it isn't easy necessarily getting a pay rise depending on where you work, but at least you are armed with information that you realise what your personal inflation rate is compared to the rest of the UK.
Okay, so let's move on to the next piece then, survivorship bias. Now, I don't actually know what this is, Damien, so I'm going to be all ears while you explain to the listeners what it is and how it can impact people.
Yeah, so survivorship bias is a concept that I think a lot of people will understand once I've explained it, and then they will start to spot it in life. And in fact, they will be able to use it to help them make better decisions, not just in finance, but generally when it comes to maybe products that they purchase or decisions that they make going forward. It's a bit like last week when I talked about the principal agent problem. If you understand that, then you can avoid falling foul of it or try to at least manage the problem. This is something very similar. Now, survivorship bias is, according to Wikipedia, the logical error of concentrating on the people or things that made it past some selection process and overlooking those that did not, typically because of their lack of visibility. And this can lead to incorrect conclusions. So I'm going to give you a very visual example so you can visualize this well and understand what survivorship bias is. Now, back in World War II, there was a famous example of survivorship bias. And what happened is that the American military wanted to protect their airplanes from being shot down. So they planned to start to reinforce and put armor on planes, and particularly they wanted to put it on key areas of the planes because obviously they wanted to reduce the weight, so they wanted to optimize decide where they were going to put the armour to reinforce these planes. So what they did is they got the planes as they came back from their missions and mapped out where the bullet holes were on the planes themselves. So they could actually then draw a map of where the most concentrated areas of direct hits were, and then the idea was to reinforce those parts. And what they saw was there were lots of them typically on the wings of the plane and some of them in the tail as well. And you can see a diagram of this if you go and look online because it's a famous example. But fortunately, a mathematician by the name of Abraham Wald realized that by trying to draw conclusions based upon the planes that made it home was a fundamentally flawed concept, because what you needed was the data on the planes that were shot down, because what they were actually looking at were planes that made it home. So those planes were shot in those areas, but they didn't fall out of the sky, which actually suggests that planes getting shot in those areas can survive. So what they had was a missing piece of information were the planes that had been shot down and where they were hit, because that was the areas that needed to be reinforced. He realized that problem and avoided this mistake. So that is survivorship bias, because you will draw a conclusion based on what you can see. And actually, in that case, the conclusion would have been the complete opposite of what they should have been reaching. So there are other areas of life where you see this kind of thing. And some more visual ideas of survivorship bias that people may have seen is looking at, for example, images of people who may have been on a particular diet that you've seen on Instagram. So they may have said that they've achieved this amazing figure based upon this particular diet or this training regime. Now, what you're doing there, again, that's a selection process of one person who has done it for this period of time and they claim they've achieved that. What you don't see are the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who may have spent just as much money as that person and started that regime and fell by the wayside and actually didn't achieve that. So that is survivorship bias, because you may then decide, I'm going to buy that product because look, that person achieved those results with that product, so I'm going to subscribe to it and pay lots of money for something. So that's survivorship bias in action. You also see it on other areas where it might be where people talk about the most successful people in business do, or most successful entrepreneurs. They do these 5 things every day. Well, again, even if that was true, which often I don't believe any of that stuff is true, if it is, then what you're seeing is an example that is maybe a correlation, if it's a true correlation, that they have these things in common, but it's not causation. It doesn't mean that if you do them, you'll actually end up with those results. What would be far more interesting is if you looked at all the entrepreneurs in the world and those that didn't make it, which would be many, many multiples more, and work out what went wrong with those. So you took all the information, you can draw conclusions. So survivorship bias exists throughout life. So one thing, if you take away from today, is try and spot survivorship bias in the media or just generally in life that you are making conclusions on. And in our current world, we make a lot of conclusions based on what we see, company or a successful person, and you try and draw conclusions based upon that without all the information. And I think taking on lots of debt is a very good example of that. Another example I want to give very quickly before I then move on to why this is important in the investing world is property is a very good example, in my view, of survivorship bias. So I see lots of things on telly talking about investing in property and all these people who've made money and how it's so wonderful and it's the only way you're going to get rich effectively. So there's lots of bias about people who've made money in property. Those are the successful people. What you do not see are the people who put all their money in property, who then fell foul because maybe they had issues in terms of rising interest rates or a whole host of things that went wrong when they were trying to do up a property. Maybe they bought property at auction. You don't see enough of the other people, the people who didn't survive and who weren't successful, to be able to draw a valid conclusion on the success rate of becoming, say, a property developer. And so therefore my view on property is being part of a diversified way of investing. That's fine. But there are people who in the past have said this is the only way you make money and almost criticize my view that putting all your eggs in one basket is not a good thing. So again, that's survivorship bias. You will find somebody who has become excessively rich by just investing in property and using leverage in that way. But there will be a lot of people who don't. So that is, again, a survivorship bias example. But what I really wanted to get onto was a far better example and probably a bigger issue when it comes to investing directly in things like funds. So what happens in the fund management world is if you have a fund that is underperforming over a long period of time, it will still have money in it. People will still invest in it because of inertia. So they might have built up millions and millions of pounds in the fund. Some people will pull money out. Some people will remain ridiculously loyal to it. We saw that in the whole Woodford saga when that went wrong, and the fund will just limp along. And what happens when funds underperform? Well, you do sometimes get a major blow up, like we saw with basically Woodford, and there's been other examples. But what often happens are funds are merged or closed down. So a fund manager will go, look, this isn't working, we're going to close it down. Or what they'll do is they'll go and merge it into another fund that they've got that's doing much better, and they'll just assimilate all that money into that fund. They'll tell the investors, as of this date, you're going to have units, for example, if it's a unit trust, in this other fund that we run. And it will be something that probably a similar mandate of some kind. And what that does is effectively eradicate that history of that bad fund. So therefore they still look like a great fund manager, but it also ensures they're still getting that percentage fee for running your money. So they don't want to necessarily give you all your money back and close the fund down, because they could assimilate it and they still maintain that income stream by charging you a fee for running that money. Why that is actually interesting is this week, Terry Smith, who is a very well-known fund manager, and lots of people follow his Fundsmith Equity Fund, he announced that he's closing an emerging market trust that he runs, and that has serially underperformed for a number of years now, and he hasn't been able to recreate the success that he's had in his Fundsmith fund, which is the main one in the emerging markets arena. But what he's going to do is actually wind that up and then give investors their money back, which he said is a very noble thing to do, because he's not going to just run it and keep taking the money and the fees for running their money. But ultimately, investors have massively underperformed for a long period of time, so make of that what you will.
Sorry to sort of stop you in your flow there, Damien, but just on that, that's the first time I've really heard of this. So how does that work? Investors getting their money back, what happens?
Well, they will ultimately just start to liquidate the holdings in that particular trust, and then they will then give the investors their money back. With investment trusts, you get this phenomenon where they can trade at discounts because they are effectively shares in a trust, so like a company that manages money, in this case in emerging markets. You can have them trade at a premium to the assets that are invested in and held by the company, or at a discount. These ones have been trading at quite a big discount. But of course, now it's going to be wound up. You saw that discount narrow because suddenly people realised that, well, we're going to effectively get the value of what in the trust itself. So the price of the shares then jumped, I think, 10% within a day or so, back towards their net asset value as a result. So that's what happens. The underperformance is the underperformance. They don't get that back, obviously, and they just get their money back from the manager once they've liquidated everything. Now, what I was going to go on to say is kind of key, is that when you look at past performance of, say, sectors or active funds or whatever universe you decide to choose, there is a survivorship bias that can occur with the data that you get. So you might see an article somewhere that says, for example, active managers have massively outperformed passive investors over a particular time frame, and they may cherry pick it because obviously it's unusual for active managers to necessarily outperform for long periods of time, but they might pick a period, for example, and say, look, active managers have done better in this kind of environment. The issue you have is that, let's say you started off, and I'm going to use made up numbers, there were 300 funds in a sector. So let's say that sector was the UK all companies sector. So that was a bunch of funds that invested in UK companies. There were 300 funds. Then over the period of the next, say, 20 years, let's say a whole bunch of them underperformed and then they merged them or closed them. And let's say you then lost, 30 funds. So there's 10% less funds in your universe. Now, what would happen is that there's a danger that somebody would look at the remaining funds and go, right, how did this sector do over the last 20 years? But they only focus on the ones that survived. So the ones that did all right, not the ones that were the real duds that would drag down the average. And so the average you get by looking at those will be higher than if they looked at the full 300 all the way through until they each closed. So what would have happened if they'd done a live average all the way through? At the start, they would have had 300 funds, then it would have dropped down to 299, then 29. And that difference in performance figures can be quite marked. So I ran the numbers just to give people an idea of what impact this has. If you've done the UK all company sector over 20 years, your money, if you'd invested according to what you often see as a sector average, you would have made 332%. So if you'd had £100,000, not accounting for survivorship bias, you'd be on £432,000 now in your portfolio, assuming you had £100,000 to start with. If you took account of survivorship bias, so you included those dud ones along the way that were merged or closed, then you would have £378,000. So the upshot is there's a £50,000 difference between those two numbers. The issue is that if you just pick the one that didn't take account of survivorship bias, you'd be effectively thinking you'd have that much more money if you'd followed that strategy of investing in a UK all companies fund and you got a typical return. The reality is very different. You would have got something that perhaps if you've got the typical return, because you could have got a dud, your typical return would be somewhere much lower, so 50 grand lower. When you use those numbers, that's quite a difference. And over the longer term, that difference gets bigger and bigger. And so the message on this part of the podcast is that when you do any investment analysis or research, or you read any research that someone else does, and it talks about going back over a period of time and analysing performances, ask yourself a question, is there some form of survivorship bias going on here? It could even be you're looking at shares or types of companies or something like that. Then you've got to ask the question, have I got the full data set? And that is a good mindset to get into when you do any kind of research or read somebody else's research. So look for the holes in the data. One tip I would give you is if you're trying to find a data source that you think is reliable, then trust Net. Their sector average data is live. And by that, I mean it does run as at the period of time you're looking at. So it does take account of survivorship. So it goes along and maps all the funds until they drop out of existence and then they're no longer in that index. So that does take account of it. So if you can rely on their numbers, I've not looked at everybody else's out there, but they do take account of that survivorship bias. But again, look for it in the investment world, be aware of it, try to manage it, and more importantly, try not to base your decisions upon incomplete data. And it's really spotting when you have incomplete data, as Abraham Wall did all those years ago, that it could mean you can make much better decisions, which ultimately could protect or increase your wealth.
Okay, so let's move on to the final piece of the podcast then. And you're going to be talking about a cost of living checklist. What's this?
So this is all about flexibility. So I wanted to do a piece because I'm conscious at the moment in my own finances, I'm trying to keep things flexible. It's always a bit of a core of a lot of what I do with money. There's never a perfect way to do anything. It's almost like playing poker when you're trying to see what hands you could get out. You keep your options open rather than just try and bank on getting one killer card at the end, which is probably very unlikely. So it's just trying to make the best of what you've got and trying to keep things flexible so you've got choices going forward. So as I'm doing that in my own life, I then realized that we need to talk about this on the podcast. So we have talked about elements of it in the last couple of podcasts relating to energy and mortgage, which I'll just touch upon before going on to like a more broader list, which isn't a complete exhaustive list of things to do, but things that come to mind that I would be looking at so I know my options. It's a bit like when you go on a plane and they're sitting there doing that safety briefing, telling you where your nearest exits are, where your life jacket is and all that stuff. And you hope that none of that's ever going to have to come into play. But it probably is not a bad idea just to have a listen and think about what you might do in a certain scenario. So in the last couple of podcasts, I've mentioned energy is one of them. So first of all, work out what your bills are likely to be going forward and over the next 12 months in particular. We've had that cap to the energy price over the next 2 years. People should be able to roughly gauge what their energy bills will be. They are at the moment about twice what they were last year. So if you know what you were paying last year, then you're going to be paying basically at least twice what you were paying back then. And the reason I say at least twice, because the price cap is a little bit above where we are currently when it comes to energy pricing. So we've talked about in the podcast, we've got links to that we can put in the show notes explaining how the price is going to work. So if you can budget for an increased spend on energy, assuming that your energy provider hasn't already just hiked your direct debits. Of course, anybody who is on a fixed energy tariff, then again, we spoke about last week about what you might want to do. If you've only been in a tariff for less than 2 weeks, you can get out of it if you want to take advantage of that energy cap. We are led to believe that people on energy caps will receive a reduction on their price per kilowatt hour, but it does mean that there will be some people who may fix at much higher prices, fearing the biggest increases next year, could still pay more than the energy cap. But of course, that is changing all the time. So this time next week, it could be a completely different story. It seems to be, at the moment, in a state of flux. But make sure you know any exit penalties that you have on tariffs. or when they're due to end if you are on one. Now, mortgages we've touched upon, and we talked about the early repayment charges. Make sure you know what they are if you're on a fixed deal already and when your fixed deal is due to end, because you will in all likelihood want to be going and fixing your mortgage again, and you need to get in touch with a mortgage broker. Well, that's the best course of action in my view, 6 months before your deal is due to expire. But what I want people to do is they now know their early repayment charge and their options. We touched upon it last week, go back and listen. But also look at things like whether your mortgage is portable and also whether you are entitled to any holidays on your mortgage. So let's say things get really tough. Have you got a period of time where you are able to take a holiday from your payments, maybe 3 to 6 months? It's not unusual for lenders to offer that. So make sure you look it up. Look up your current deal, find out if there is any holiday, because what we're really thinking about here is what would happen. We're going into possibly a tough period for the economy. A recession is almost certain. If you listen to the Bank of England, then that can mean that job losses will occur and things will get difficult. What will happen if you go into work tomorrow and you were made redundant? Your world would feel like it's falling apart. But if you already know possibly where your emergency exit is, where that life jacket is, then it may give you some sense of control and you'll be able to make adjustments quickly. Now, car financing is another one. If you've got a car on finance, go and look at what type of car finance you've got. Also, go and look at when you've got a balloon payment due, if you have got one due. Think about how you're going to afford to pay that. Look at the price of your car currently versus what you've got outstanding on your car finance. Go back and listen to the podcast I did earlier in the year where I talked about how now is a time where you can get out of your car financing deals because the second-hand car market is so buoyant, the price that you get. Also, do look at the get-outs you've got on your financing deal. There will often be a point where you can walk away after a certain period of time, and it will mean that you'll walk away without a car. But if you are in a situation where things are going to get really tight, then that may be something that can give for you financially, and then you have to work out other means of transport. Moving on to other areas. So we're not going to go through food and every single bill you've got, because obviously it goes without saying to look at your food bills and trying to cut all of the bills you've got. But in particular on things like mobile and broadband, do look at when your contract expires with them. And that is particularly true on mobile, because you can end up finding you've been funding a handset for a very long time and you're due maybe to come to the end of that deal period where you can switch onto something else. So get to know what those dates are. When it comes to things like rental agreements, make sure you know when your break clauses are, make sure you know what notice periods you've got to get, and also when your rent could be increased by. Gym contracts are another one. So know when you can get out of a gym contract. Know when they're due to come up for perhaps renewal if you're going to sign up to a new gym. Anything you sign up to, you need to check the get out of them, because you may need to get out of them very quickly, and you don't want to sign up to a contract where they're going to be insisting that you pay off the remainder of that given contract. And going back to the mobile phone, it may be a point where you think, well, do you know what? I'm going to move on to a SIM-only deal at the point that I can, and I'm going to hold off getting a brand new phone because I don't want to be stuck into another 24-month contract or anything like that that subsidizes the cost of the phone. Also look at the idea of warranties that you may have on products at home. So you may have some expensive products at home that will be very difficult to replace. You may find that you have warranties on there that you've not noted down or registered. So make sure you look at that. Good example is a boiler. If you've had a boiler put in the last year, there's likely to be a warranty on there, which if you service the boiler every year means that any repairs will be free. That leads me on quite nicely to the idea of insurance. Look at your different insurances that you've got, and in particular whether there's periods where you can self-insure. If you go back to podcast episode 324, we did a piece called Insurance Risk versus Reward. And there's a great little image I created on there which looks at the probability of an event versus the severity of loss and tells you when it's good to take out insurance, when it's more sensible to reduce risk, when it's sensible just to budget for it or self-insure. So go and have a look at that, because it may be that you start to list your insurances that you have, you pay direct debits for, and put them in an order in which you might want to cancel them. Because unfortunately, some people will jump in at the deep end and they might cancel something like their life insurance, for example, when there are other insurances which they could actually get rid of because the severity of loss is low and the probability of an event happening where they could make a claim is very low as well. So again, that is just an idea, like, you know where your nearest exit is. Do you know the way in which you'd cancel down those products? And you don't have to do it now if you can afford to keep them. It's just something that stops a knee-jerk reaction, gives you a sense of control if the worst were to happen. Then leading on from that, of course, do your subscription and direct debit audit. Go down and look at the things you do and don't need. Let's assume people have already trimmed back on the stuff they don't need. Then look at the things that you could trim back on. A bit like I said about the insurances, which things could you give up first and in which order? And therefore, when you get to that scenario, you can then make a sensible decision and decide what leeway you've got on your finances, because you want to see what is the limit to which you can stretch. The other thing I would also look at, I'm not obviously a fan of people taking on extra debt, and we always want people to pay more than the minimum on any of their debts that they have and try and clear them. But sometimes needs must. So make sure you know what the minimum payment is on your credit cards, because if suddenly you had to cut back on what you were paying on your debts because of some unfortunate, unforeseen circumstance, then at least you know what extra room you have for the cash flow now that you can spend perhaps to eat. Also, how much credit do you have available to you? Again, you don't want to use it, but for a temporary period for cash flow, it may be something that you have access to. Of course, a cash buffer is by far the best thing. So have you got a cash buffer? Can you build a cash buffer? Something we've talked about in recent weeks. As a plug for the MOT, so Damien's Money MOT, we'll put a link in the show notes. But if you go to mot.moneytothemasses.com, you can take a 2-minute money MOT that will look at all areas of your finances. It is anonymous. You can register to get an action plan following your answers once your assessment is given to you if you want to see how you improve your finances. But you get an overall rating for how your finances are doing, and it's compared to the rest of the UK for people in a similar scenario as you. So it's not against everybody, it's against people who are in a similar position to you. And it tells you the areas that you can improve in. That will cover lots of what I'm talking about now. And in particular, one of the first bits that I try and get people to look at are you on the right tax code, and have you checked any benefit entitlements that you have? So there are a lot of people out there who don't claim benefits that they are entitled to, and they may not know about them. So make sure you go online and take the MOT. You can go into entitled to. If you type that in all one word into Google, it is a website that provides a simple tool. You plug in some information, it tells you any benefits that you may be entitled to. So that may be able to help. With regards to your employment, if you are employed, then look at what your notice period is, what is your redundancy package, and what employee benefits you have access to. All of those things could be important when you're trying to plan for the worst. So again, where are your emergency exits? Hopefully none of this comes into play, but at least you know where you stand, because if the worst was to happen and things were going to get very tight or you were going to lose your job, these are the sorts of things that you will be forced to do. It's better to do them in advance at your leisure. The other thing I would say is make sure you go and look at your credit report. So you want to optimize your credit worthiness in case you need to take out credit of some kind. So make sure you check all your various different credit reports with different agencies. You can find out how to do that on the Money to the Masses website. And also for people who are perhaps nearing retirement, they could look at their pension benefits so they can see what their pension might be as well, because they may end up deciding if something happens, they retire, or they might want to draw down on some of their benefits. Now, before you ever do that, make sure you seek advice, because there are consequences of you accessing your pension. Maybe if you're 55 because you're struggling, it can have implications on what you can put into pension going forward. We've covered it on the podcast, but again, we'll link to a few relevant articles in the show notes. And the other thing is just overall, if you are forced to make any large scale purchases in the next year, how are you going to pay for them? So maybe your boiler blows up. Have you got an emergency fund, access to credit, overdraft, any of these things? What flexibility do you have? On one last one, which won't impact a lot of people, but there will be listeners to the podcast who, for example, pay school fees. Now, if you are going to be in a period of financial strife, then do engage with them, because it is possible, and I've heard of people who've managed to have a break on the school fees during a period of hardship, so not having to immediately withdraw their children from the school. So I put it out there. It's something that I don't have personal experience of, but anecdotally I have heard of people that have managed to, for a very short period of time, get some relief on those fees. So that was a quick rundown on judging how flexible your finances are, and therefore help you make better decisions to try and keep them more flexible. Or maybe it's a case that you can make decisions now to increase that flexibility, because when you're going into a period of uncertainty, it's better to prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
Okay, so that's it. We're done for this week. If you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so in the usual way. It's damien@moneytothemasses.com. And of course, you can interact with Money to the Masses via our socials. That's Instagram and also YouTube. Our Money to the Masses community group on Facebook is growing day by day. If you haven't joined that group, please do so. It's facebook.com/groups/Money to the Masses to get involved. And it's a really good way that you can suggest topics for future podcasts as well.
And on that note, Andy, the community on Facebook has just hit 4,200 members. So why not come and join the community? So until next time.
Until next time.